The soft chime of the store's entrance bell rang as the glass doors slid open. A woman stepped inside, her posture tense, her gaze shifting nervously from one corner of the store to another. She wasn't dressed in luxury, her clothes were clean but simple, a stark contrast to the designer outfits draped over the mannequins nearby. A ripple of change spread through the store. The chatter between customers slowed. Employees, who had been preoccupied with folding clothes and arranging displays, suddenly took notice. Their glances were quick but unmistakable, sizing her up, assessing whether she belonged here. She ignored them. Keeping her chin lifted, she walked further in, her eyes scanning the racks. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She had been saving for months, working extra shifts, cutting back on expenses. And now, finally, she was here. A pair of women near the counter whispered behind manicured hands. One let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. An older man browsing the watches cast a brief look of curiosity before returning to his selection. The employees, however, weren't as subtle. The store manager, a tall man with a crisp navy suit and an air of superiority, stepped forward with the kind of smile that wasn't welcoming, it was condescending. "Miss, can I help you?" There it was. That tone. The kind that suggested she was lost, that she was in the wrong place. She met his gaze evenly. "I know what I'm looking for." His smile remained, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, mild surprise that she had spoken with confidence. "Of course," he said smoothly. "But you should know, we have a policy." He gestured towards the velvet rope sectioning off part of the store. "Some items are reserved for customers with membership status. We cater to a particular clientele." The implication hung in the air. She wasn't part of that clientele. A slow heat crawled up her neck, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she turned her attention back to the shelves. She wouldn't let them push her out. Then, from behind her, came a voice, sharp and loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words came from a middle-aged woman in an expensive blazer, her arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at her lips. A few people chuckled under their breath. The store manager didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. For a moment, the woman hesitated. Should she just walk away? Was it even worth it? Then, just as she was about to turn, something unexpected happened. A man, a complete stranger, stepped forward. His presence alone was enough to silence the store. He wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did he carry the air of someone wealthy. Yet, there was something about him, something commanding. And then he spoke. What he said next left the entire store stunned. The store went silent. The air itself seemed to pause as every set of eyes shifted toward the man who had stepped forward. He was tall, his posture relaxed yet firm, dressed in simple jeans and a dark brown jacket. His face carried the marks of experience, lines at the corners of his eyes, a hint of silver at his temples. But it wasn't his appearance that held the room captive. It was his presence. Unbothered by the store manager's stiff posture or the judgmental stares of the customers, he took a step closer to the woman who had been humiliated moments ago. "Is this how you treat paying customers?" His voice was steady, neither aggressive nor loud, but it carried weight. The store manager blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, I was simply explaining, I heard you." The man tilted his head slightly. "And I also heard what that woman just said to her." He gestured toward the lady in the blazer who had made the snide remark. The woman scoffed. "I was just making an observation." The man turned his gaze to her, calm and unwavering. "An observation?" His lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. "No, you were making a judgment." "Big difference." The woman's face reddened slightly. The store manager cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, if you have a concern, I'd be happy to address it. But we have store policies in place." The man took another step forward, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had been humiliated. "What policies?" The store manager hesitated. "As I explained, we cater to a specific clientele. Certain items are reserved for members." The man let out a low hum, as if considering this. Then, without another word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. A black membership card gleamed under the store's bright lights. The color drained from the manager's face. The stranger handed the card to the stunned employee behind the counter. "Go ahead. Check it." The employee fumbled to scan the card, their hands visibly shaking. A small beep confirmed its validity. The screen flashed a status that made the employee's mouth fall open. The man wasn't just a member, he was a VIP member. The customers who had whispered before now stared in stunned silence. The man turned his attention back to the woman beside him. "You said you know what you're looking for?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Then go ahead," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Pick whatever you came for." "It's on me." The store manager visibly swallowed. "Sir, I wasn't talking to you." The man's voice was sharp enough to cut. The woman looked at him, unsure if she should accept his offer. But then he leaned in slightly and said something only she could hear. "Don't let them decide your worth." Something inside her shifted. Lifting her chin, she turned and walked towards the section she had originally been heading for. The manager didn't dare stop her this time. The stranger watched with quiet satisfaction before turning his gaze back to the crowd. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused. The store manager, still rattled, furrowed his brows. "What is?" The man smiled faintly. How quickly people change their tune when they realize who's really in charge. The store remained silent. The real shift hadn't been in the policy, it had been in the people. And the lesson was just beginning. The woman's footsteps were steady as she walked toward the display case, ignoring the murmurs still lingering in the air. The sting of humiliation remained, but something had shifted. She wasn't just enduring the moment anymore, she was reclaiming it. The store manager, still flustered from the unexpected turn of events, tried to regain his composure. He straightened his tie and forced a smile, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. "Sir," he addressed the stranger cautiously, "I apologize for any misunderstanding. Our policies are in place to ensure." The man turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "To ensure what?" The manager hesitated. "To maintain exclusivity." The stranger let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "Exclusivity," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Interesting choice." The store manager stiffened. You ever wonder what exclusivity costs?" The stranger's tone remained calm, yet his words carried an edge. "Not just in profits, but in something more important." The store manager's brow furrowed, clearly unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, the woman reached the case she had been eyeing from the start. It contained a delicate gold bracelet, simple yet elegant. It wasn't the most expensive item in the store, but it meant something to her. The employee behind the counter hesitated. "Would you like to see it?" The question shouldn't have been significant, but it was. A few moments ago, they wouldn't have asked. She nodded. The employee carefully removed the bracelet from the case and placed it in her hand. She traced her fingers over the intricate design, feeling the cool metal against her skin. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself something beautiful. She turned slightly, glancing at the stranger who had stepped in for her. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, an unspoken understanding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. The man looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because I've been where you are." She blinked. What do you mean? The stranger exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting over the store, as if seeing something beyond the walls. Once upon a time, he said, I walked into a place like this. The store fell into silence as he continued. They looked at me the way they looked at you. His voice was even, but there was something beneath it, something heavy. They assumed I didn't belong. Assumed I didn't deserve to be there. The woman studied him, sensing this wasn't just about her. What happened? He smiled faintly. Someone reminded me I didn't have to prove anything to them. She tightened her grip on the bracelet. The weight of his words settled over her, sinking deeper than she expected. The store manager cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Sir, while your status does entitle you to, the stranger cut him off with a glance. Entitle, he repeated. Tell me, if I wasn't holding that membership card, would you still be talking to me like this? The store manager faltered. The man chuckled lightly, shaking his head. That's the thing about status, isn't it? It only matters to the people who think it defines them. The store remained silent. The woman let out a slow breath and turned to the employee. I'll take it, she said, holding up the bracelet. The employee nodded quickly, eager to complete the sale. But before they could ring it up, the stranger reached forward, placing his hand over hers gently. Not yet. She looked at him, puzzled. Why not? He turned back to the store manager. Because I want to hear you say it. The manager frowned. Say what? That she belongs here, the man said simply. That every single person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they have a membership or not. The manager swallowed hard, glancing around at the other customers, many of whom were now watching him closely. The woman arched a brow. Well? The manager hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. But he also knew he had no choice. Of course, he said stiffly. All customers are welcome here. The stranger smiled slightly. Good. He turned to the woman. Now you can buy it. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You're something else. The man shrugged. Just someone who knows what it feels like. As she handed over her payment, the atmosphere in the store felt different. The tension had lifted, replaced by something else, something unspoken, but powerful. Change. Not in policies. Not in procedures. But in perception. And sometimes, that was the most valuable change of all. The receipt printed with a soft hum, the finality of the transaction sinking into the silence that had settled over the store. The woman held the small bag in her hands, her fingers pressing against the cool paper as if anchoring herself to the moment. She had walked in as an outsider. Now, she was walking out with something more than just a bracelet, she was walking out with her dignity intact. But the stranger wasn't done. He turned to the store manager, his expression still composed, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. One more thing, he said. The manager stiffened, his polished professionalism wearing thin under the weight of scrutiny. Yes? I want to make a purchase, the stranger said. That got the employee's attention. The store manager's demeanor shifted in an instant. A flicker of relief passed over his face. Of course, he said, smiling as if the tension of the last few minutes had never happened. What would you like to see? We have a private selection of... No, the man interrupted. Not for me. The manager hesitated. Excuse me? The stranger turned slightly, his gaze landing on a young employee who had been standing quietly behind the counter the entire time. The kid couldn't have been older than 19, his uniform just a little too big for his frame, his name tag slightly crooked. He had watched the entire interaction unfold with wide eyes, shifting nervously as if afraid to be noticed. The stranger nodded toward him. What's your name? The employee swallowed hard. Rian, sir. The stranger nodded. How long have you worked here, Rian? 6 months, Rian said quickly. He looked at the store manager, as if unsure whether he was allowed to answer. The manager forced another smile, though there was a nervous edge to it now. Rian is one of our newer employees. A hard worker. The stranger hummed thoughtfully. That so? Rian gave a small nod. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet once more. He slid a platinum card onto the counter. I'd like to buy something for Rian. The silence that followed was deafening. The manager blinked. I'm sorry. The stranger smiled slightly. You heard me. The manager forced a chuckle, clearly confused. Sir, our employees aren't typically part of, that a policy too? The man asked, raising an eyebrow. The manager hesitated. Well, not exactly, but, good, the stranger said. Then there's no issue. He turned to Rian. Pick something. Rian looked like he had just been struck by lightning. Me? The stranger nodded. Yes, you. Rian's gaze darted to the store manager, then back to the man. But, why? The stranger tilted his head slightly. Because you watched all of this happen. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. You saw the way they treated her. You saw how quickly they changed their tune the moment they thought I was someone important. Rian swallowed. The man leaned in slightly. What did you think of that? Rian hesitated, his hands gripping the counter. He looked at the woman who had just been humiliated minutes ago. He looked at the manager, who was now shifting uncomfortably. Then, finally, he met the stranger's gaze. I didn't like it, he admitted quietly. The stranger nodded. Good. Rian hesitated. But I didn't say anything either. The man's expression didn't change. And now? Rian exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but something inside him felt different. He straightened his shoulders slightly, as if finding his own footing. I'd like to choose something, he said finally. The store manager's expression twisted, but he didn't dare protest. The stranger grinned. Good choice. Rian moved toward one of the shelves, scanning the items. He didn't pick the most expensive thing. He didn't pick something extravagant. He picked something simple, a leather-bound journal. This, he said, holding it up. The stranger glanced at the item and nodded approvingly. Smart choice. The store manager forced a polite smile. Very well, sir, we'll ring that up for you. The man handed over his card, the transaction smooth and effortless. But the weight of the moment was far heavier than any monetary exchange. As Rian took the small bag with his new journal inside, he turned to the stranger with an expression of quiet gratitude. Thank you, he said sincerely. The man studied him for a moment. Then he leaned in slightly, just enough so that only Rian could hear. Don't forget what this feels like, he said. Someday, you'll be the one deciding who gets a voice. Make sure you choose right. Rian swallowed hard, nodding. The stranger pulled back, giving him one last pat on the shoulder before turning to the woman who had started it all. You ready to go? He asked. She glanced between him and Rian, then down at the bag in her hands. For the first time since stepping into the store, she smiled. Yeah, she said. I think I am. And with that, they walked out. But the echoes of what had happened would remain long after they were gone. And the real test of character had only just begun. The store doors slid shut behind them, sealing in the lingering silence that had settled over the space they left behind. The woman exhaled, gripping the small bag in her hands. It wasn't just about the bracelet anymore, it was about everything that had just happened. She turned to the stranger. I still don't understand. The man tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. Understand what? Why you did all this, she said. Why you stepped in. The stranger studied her for a moment, then started walking. She followed, her pace matching his. The city around them buzzed with life, cars passing, people moving, neon signs flickering against the evening sky. Finally, he spoke. People like to believe the world is fair, he said. That the system works. That if you follow the rules, you'll be treated the same as everyone else. She frowned. And you don't believe that? The stranger gave a small, knowing smile. I believe the rules change depending on who's playing the game. She let that sink in for a moment. So what, you just go around fixing things when you see them? He shrugged. Not always. She stopped walking. Then why today? The stranger halted too, turning to face her. Because today, I could. Something about the simplicity of that answer hit her harder than she expected. She had spent her whole life navigating spaces like that store. Knowing she had to prove herself in ways others didn't. Knowing she had to be twice as good, twice as careful, twice as strong. And yet, here was a man who had simply stepped in, because he could. She looked down at the bag in her hands. I would have walked out of there. I know. I would have let them win. The stranger tilted his head slightly. Maybe. She exhaled, shaking her head. I don't even know your name. The stranger chuckled. Names aren't that important. She arched a brow. Easy to say when people actually respect yours. His smile faltered for just a second. Just enough for her to catch it. She studied him, a realization forming. It happened to you too, didn't it? The stranger didn't answer right away. But he didn't have to. She saw it now, in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke, in the way he had recognized what was happening to her before she had even processed it herself. He had lived it. Maybe not in that store. Maybe not in the same way. But he had been her before. She let out a slow breath. So what now? The stranger's lips quirked. That's up to you. She narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? You walked into that store thinking you were just buying a bracelet, he said. But now you're walking out with something else. She frowned. And what's that? He smiled. A choice. She blinked. A choice to decide what you do with today, he continued. To decide if you let it be just another bad experience, or if you make it mean something more. The weight of his words settled over her. She had spent so much of her life just surviving these moments. Just moving past them, pretending they didn't matter. But they did. She tightened her grip on the bag. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she didn't just let it go. If she did something more. She looked up at the stranger. And what about you? He smiled faintly. My job here is done. She scoffed. That's a little dramatic. He chuckled. Maybe. They stood there for a moment, the city buzzing around them. Then, just as quickly as he had entered her life, the stranger turned and walked away. She watched him go, knowing she'd probably never see him again. But something told her she wouldn't forget him. And something else told her, he wasn't really gone. Because people like him? They always had a way of showing up when you least expected them. And when you needed them most. She stood there for a long moment, the city buzzing around her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The stranger was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost, leaving behind only his words. A choice. She clutched the small bag in her hands, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep inside her. She had spent years walking away from moments like this, choosing silence, choosing to move on, choosing to forget. But tonight, something was different. She turned back toward the store, her eyes narrowing slightly. Would they forget? Would they go back to the way things were the moment she left? A thought formed, sharp and unshakable. Not this time. She squared her shoulders and took a deep breath before walking back through the doors. The same soft chime rang out as she entered, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. Employees glanced up, their expressions flickering between confusion and discomfort. The store manager, who had just begun relaxing after the stranger's departure, tensed the moment he saw her. "Miss." His voice was careful now, no longer condescending but still wary. She stepped forward. "I have something to say." A few customers nearby turned to watch, sensing something unusual. The manager forced a polite smile. "If there was an issue with your purchase, I assure you, there was an issue," she interrupted, her voice steady. "And we both know it had nothing to do with the bracelet." The room went still. The manager swallowed hard. I want to know something," she said, crossing her arms. "If that man hadn't stepped in, would you have let me buy it?" The manager hesitated, glancing around as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "Miss, yes or no?" she pressed. His jaw clenched. "That's not a fair yes," a voice said from behind the counter. She turned, surprised to see Rian, the young employee, stepping forward. The manager shot him a warning look, but Rian held his ground. "No," Rian corrected himself, meeting her gaze. "No, they wouldn't have let you buy it." A hushed murmur spread through the store. The woman exhaled, nodding. "Thank you for being honest." The manager's face paled. "Rian, that's enough." "No, it's not," Rian said, his voice gaining strength. He turned toward the customers. "Because this happens all the time. And nobody ever says anything." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked genuinely surprised, as if they had never considered it before. The woman let his words settle before speaking again. "I'm not here to make a scene," she said. "I just want you to think about something." She turned toward the customers now. "What if it was you?" she asked. "What if you walked into a store, just looking to buy something for yourself, and everyone around you decided, before you even spoke, that you didn't belong?" A woman near the perfume display looked down, clearly uncomfortable. A man in a tailored suit rubbed his jaw, avoiding eye contact. The woman let the silence stretch before finishing. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I just need you to remember this moment." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. This time, as she left, no one whispered. No one chuckled. And for the first time in a long time, she walked away not just with what she had come for, but with something even more valuable. Her voice. As she stepped out of the store, the cool night air hit her like a wave of clarity. Her heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from something else. Something stronger. Power. She had spoken up. She had made them listen. And for the first time, she realized just how much she had been holding in for so many years. She started walking, her grip on the bag tightening as she replayed everything that had happened in the last hour. The stranger, the store manager, Rian, every piece of the puzzle coming together in a way she never expected. Then, a voice called out behind her. "Wait." She turned, surprised to see Rian jogging toward her, his face flushed, his uniform slightly untucked. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to be seen talking to me? Pretty sure your boss isn't a fan." Rian let out a breathless chuckle. "Yeah, well. I think I just quit." She blinked. "You what?" He shrugged. "I mean, I didn't say the words yet, but after what happened in there, I don't think I can stay." She studied him for a moment. "That can't be an easy decision." "It's not," he admitted. "But it's the right one." Something about his certainty made her smile. She hadn't expected an ally today. But maybe she had found one anyway. I wanted to tell you something, Rian continued, shifting his weight. Something I didn't say in there. She crossed her arms. I'm listening. He hesitated, then said, You remind me of my mom. That caught her off guard. Your mom? He nodded. She passed away a few years ago. Her expression softened. I'm sorry. She used to tell me something, Rian continued. That people will always try to shrink you down to make themselves feel bigger. And if you let them, they'll keep doing it. She exhaled slowly. She sounds like she was a smart woman. Rian smiled, a little sadly. She was. There was a beat of silence. Then, he said, she would have liked you. Something tightened in her chest. Not because of the compliment, but because of what it meant. Today wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been in her shoes. It was about every moment people had been forced to shrink themselves, just to make it through the day. And it was about choosing, finally choosing, not to shrink anymore. She met Rian's gaze. You're gonna be okay, you know. Rian huffed a quiet laugh. I hope so. She smiled. You will. He nodded, taking a step back. Take care. You too. And with that, he turned and walked away. She watched him go, a feeling of quiet satisfaction settling over her. She had walked into that store just wanting a bracelet. She had walked out with something much more valuable. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Because change didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments like these. She walked away from the store, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The weight of the bracelet in her bag felt heavier than before, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was proof. Proof that she had stood her ground. Proof that she had refused to be erased. She had spent so much of her life letting moments like these slip away, convincing herself they weren't worth the fight. But today, she had spoken up. And because of that, she had changed something. Maybe not the entire world. But enough. She crossed the street, stepping into a quieter part of the city, where the glow of streetlights softened the harsh edges of the night. That's when she noticed him. The stranger. He was standing near a cafe, hands in his pockets, watching her with a knowing expression. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're still here. He smirked. I could say the same about you. She crossed her arms. You knew I was going to go back in, didn't you? He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, I had a feeling. She narrowed her eyes. And what would you have done if I didn't? He shrugged. That wasn't my choice to make. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't get you. That's okay, he said. You don't have to. She let out a dry chuckle. You always talk in riddles. He grinned. Only when they work. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. There was something about him, something frustrating, but also reassuring. Like he had seen all of this before. Like he had been here before. So what now? She asked. He tilted his head. What do you think? She considered that for a moment. She had walked away from the store, thinking the moment was over. But was it? She had spoken up. Now, what was she going to do with that? I think, she took a slow breath. I don't want this to be the end of it. The stranger nodded, as if he had been waiting for her to say that. Then don't let it be. She frowned. It's not that simple. Sure it is. She scoffed. Says the guy who just disappears into the night after dropping life lessons on people. He chuckled. Fair point. She shook her head, still thinking. I mean, I want people to hear about what happened. Not just because of me, but because it keeps happening. People need to know. Then tell them. She arched a brow. You make it sound so easy. He met her gaze, his expression serious now. Because it is. She let out a slow breath. What if no one listens? His lips quirked slightly. They will. She studied him. How do you know? Because you listened. That stopped her. Because he was right. She hadn't just heard what had happened, she had felt it. She had let it change her. And if she could change, maybe others could too. She glanced at the cafe behind him, the soft hum of conversation spilling out onto the street. A few people sat inside, laughing, scrolling on their phones. Living their lives. She thought about Rian. About the customers in the store. About the ones who had looked away, and the ones who had chosen to see. Then, she looked at the stranger one last time. And for the first time, she understood. This wasn't about him. It never had been. He had never been the answer. He had just been the reminder that the answer had been in her all along. She smiled faintly. You know, you're kind of annoying. He laughed. I get that a lot. She shook her head, glancing at the cafe again. Then, before she could overthink it, she stepped toward the door. The stranger watched her go, his expression unreadable. She didn't look back. Because she didn't need to. This was her story now. And she was just getting started. The cafe door swung open, and the warmth of conversation, clinking cups, and the hum of life greeted her. She hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say yet. She just knew she had to start somewhere. She found a quiet table in the corner, pulling out her phone. For a moment, she stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, she started typing. Tonight, I walked into a store expecting nothing but silence. I walked out realizing I had a voice. I wasn't the only one. A stranger reminded me that we don't have to prove our worth to people who refuse to see it. That we don't have to shrink ourselves just to make others comfortable. But the real lesson? We all have a choice. To walk away, or to say something. To let things stay the way they are, or to change them. Today, I chose to speak up. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow, someone else will too. She read the words twice, her chest tightening. Then, without overthinking it, she hit post. She set the phone down and let out a slow breath. There. It was out in the world now. No taking it back. A few minutes passed. Then, her phone vibrated. Then again. And again. She blinked. Notifications were rolling in, comments, shares, people responding faster than she expected. Some were from strangers. Some were from people she hadn't spoken to in years. She opened one message at random. This happened to me too. Thank you for saying something. Another. I never thought about it like this. But you're right. We need to do better. And then another. I wish I had spoken up when it happened to me. But I will next time. Her breath caught. She had spent so long believing her voice didn't matter. That no one would care. But here was proof. People were listening. She looked up, glancing around the cafe. No one knew what had just happened. To them, she was just another person sitting at a table, sipping coffee, lost in thought. But she wasn't the same person she had been an hour ago. She knew something now. Words had power. Stories had power. And she had both. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. Not bad. She turned, startled. The stranger was standing outside, looking in through the window. She frowned, standing quickly and pushing the door open. Okay, seriously. Do you have some kind of dramatic timing superpower? He chuckled. Just good instincts. She crossed her arms. You saw the post, didn't you? He nodded. I did. She narrowed her eyes. And? He smiled. And I think you finally get it. She exhaled, shaking her head. Took me long enough. He shrugged. Some lessons are worth the wait. She glanced down at her phone, where more notifications were rolling in. She wasn't just another person letting things happen to her anymore. She was making them happen. She looked back up at him. You do this often? What? Go around throwing people into existential crises and then disappearing into the night? He laughed. Only when necessary. She smiled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched behind them, alive and buzzing with possibility. Then, finally, she said, "Thank you." His expression softened. No need. But she shook her head. No. There is. Because without him, she might have walked away. And now? She was walking forward. He nodded once, stepping back. You'll do fine. She smirked. You sure? Yeah, he said. I am. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. She didn't stop him this time. She just watched until he disappeared into the crowd. Then, with one last deep breath, she turned back toward the city. She had a voice now. And she was going to use it. Because someone, somewhere, was still afraid to speak. And maybe, just maybe, her words would be the ones to help them find their own.